Hey, everybody.
Hello. First, we'd like to say congratulations on the launch of the Handbook. It's a momentous and comprehensive collection, and we're thrilled that it's been made as an open source and accessible collection of chapters, which is great because it's massive.
Who would have thought that an issue as hidden, neglected, and tabooed the world over could result in so many pages and so many perspectives?
Well, we would. I'm Christina Youngberg.
And I'm Wendy Anderson.
And we run The Case for Her. The Case for Her is a philanthropic investment portfolio addressing key women's health issues like menstrual health. Key to the development of the menstrual health space is focused investment in research. The Palgrave Handbook of Critical Menstruation Studies adds to this body of research, and we hope for more.
Those of us familiar with menstrual space know that funding specifically directed to menstrual health and hygiene programs is minimal, and that available funding is largely focused on sanitation. Limited and fragmented funding results in inadequate data on the MH experience and limited evidence on effective interventions for improving MH. Without strong evidence, MH programs risk being inconsistent and reactive, since program implementers and governments who do recognize the opportunity in MH often lack an understanding of how to fully address it.
The absence of a strong evidence base for menstrual health also frustrates funders. They lack metrics and guidelines that would support them in funding more innovative programming. In addition, menstrual health interventions are so often fragmented across silos within which funders and organizations operate. Rigorous evaluation is also limited, and the available evidence base is incomplete.
To develop and implement successful MH interventions, we need to prioritize data-driven learning and invest in MH research, both new and in processing the amount of information that we already have, some of which is so fabulously bound and presented in the Critical Handbook.
So a big round of applause is due to the editors and all the contributors.
Yay!
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me to join the launch of the Open Access Palgrave Handbook for Critical Menstruation Studies. Our organisation has a long history of collaboration with researchers, experts and women activists working on menstrual health and hygiene, and more broadly on gender equality and women's empowerment issues. We have been delighted to work with you on this important publication. From the beginning of 2021, we will become the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund, a new global financing organisation to tackle the huge sanitation, hygiene and importantly the menstrual health gap. With our partners and working directly with national governments, we will catalyse and invest resources to accelerate the delivery of sanitation and hygiene services. It is only with sustained and well-targeted investments in countries that we will see a tangible shift in attitudes, practices and the lack of services and choices that result in unacceptable discrimination towards menstruators. We can't work in a vacuum. While there is a groundswell of excellent community work, activism and media interest, and in part due to the lack of compelling data, we are yet to persuade many governments to take the necessary actions to secure a menstruator's right to health, education, economic empowerment, and to participation in society without preconditions. Therefore, as we enter dialogue with governments, this handbook will provide them with critical information and learning and guide national policies and programmes. I would like to commend you again for all of your contributions and your interests, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Julita Onobanjo, and I work with UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund. And I'm really glad to have contributed to one of the chapters of the handbook. Menstruation is a significant occurrence in the lives of women and girls. It should be valued as a natural and important part of the life course of a woman's experience. Unfortunately, millions of girls and women in Africa and across the globe continue to face challenges in their ability to menstruate without fear and with dignity. And this is due to a number of reasons, but indeed the persistent inequalities when it comes to realizing their sexual and reproductive health and rights. It is particularly unsettling that many girls and women with disabilities, transgender people, people living with HIV, sex workers, female prisoners, and those who have been displaced or affected by conflict and humanitarian emergencies, including the current COVID-19 pandemic, are often not adequately supported as they have their menstrual cycle. UNFPA, the United Nations Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, works tirelessly with its partners to change this narrative and to ensure access to sexual and reproductive health and rights for all people, including access to dignified menstrual health and hygiene. And with the over 600-member Africa Coalition for Menstrual Health Management, UNFPA advocates for menstrual health as a human rights issue, first, as an integral part of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and as a key ingredient to the well-being of millions of people who menstruate. UNFPA looks forward to that day when the world understands and accepts that menstruation is a normal, natural process, and there is an end to menstrual stigma, menstrual inequalities, and menstrual poverty. And we work towards a world in which menstrual health is fully accepted and integrated into sexual reproductive health and rights and the related policies and programs. And in a way, this is what we've brought to the chapter on menstrual health and hygiene, emergence, and the future direction.
Hello, my name is Neville Okwaro. I'm a menstrual hygiene management trainer with the Water Supply and Sanitation Collaborative Council. And at the same time, I've been supporting the Ministry of Health in Kenya on matters of MHM, and in particular, during the process of developing the menstrual hygiene management policy. And one thing that we learned from this particular process was that the policy-making process is a complex and multifactorial process that is non-linear and involves so many stakeholders with vested interest. And for us to ensure that we've gotten credible information to include in that policy, one thing that we realized was the need to have credible research and also evidence that has been accrued through practice. And this is where the Handbook of Critical Menstrual Studies comes in. If we would have gotten this book earlier, maybe we would not have taken quite a long time developing the policy, because we will have had evidence at our fingertips. Because this is like a one-stop shop for all the materials and all the information that you need about MHM. It has contributors and authors who have immense experience in research, in issues of implementation and practice, and also at the same time, some of the legal aspects that underpin the issues of menstrual hygiene management are in that particular book.
My chapter is called The Realities of Period Poverty: How Homelessness Shapes Women's Lived Experiences of Menstruation. I focused my study in Bristol, which is the city in southwest England with one of the highest levels of homelessness in the country. I spoke to 40 cis women who were experiencing varying forms of homelessness about their experiences of menstruation while living in this difficult situation. I also explore in the chapter the efficacy of charitable initiatives who support menstruators experiencing homelessness. To give you a snippet of these experiences, I'm going to read out a couple of quotes from the women I spoke to. It's quite tough and it's embarrassing when you think you're smelly. Menstruation makes me irritable, it makes me tired and it gives me back problems, and I can't move. And obviously in the situation that I'm in the moment, it's quite difficult. This highlights the tension between her experience of homelessness and her experiences of menstruation. While she's menstruating, she can't move, while simultaneously having to be constantly mobile, changing from one house to another. Many of the women I spoke to highlighted warmth and comfort as an important factor to alleviate negative symptoms of menstruation. The women considered spaces such as multifunctional day centres extremely useful, considering that if you stay too long in a cafe, they ask you to buy something or make you leave. Other participants use their social networks to stay comfortable and warm throughout the day while they were menstruating. One woman told me, I've got some good people on my side. I'll turn up and say, right, I need a couple of hours, and they'll let me go around and sit there with a hot water bottle. However, this experience isn't shared by all. For the disconnected woman without such networks, she must take rest and refuge within the public spaces of the city. When it was hurting a lot, I just had to sit down for a bit, just on the bench. I had nowhere else I could go. Another participant told me, I would love to just be somewhere and not feel like an intruder. The streets, homelessness shelters, and spaces in friends' homes barely offer true privacy. The extreme visibility of homelessness contrasts sharply with the privacy needed for the very private act of managing their menstruation, and the safe space needed to rest fully.
The common belief in India is that menstruating women are impure and polluting. Religion and culture have placed taboos on menstruating women in every space they occupy, at home, at work, and at places of worship. At home, a menstruating woman is prohibited from preparing food, touching pickle, curd, and spice containers, cooking utensils, and even entering the kitchen and the puja room, a sacred room where idols are kept and worshipped. In agricultural work, she is told not to touch the crops as they will die. Though an urban middle-class Indian woman, I did not experience these menstrual taboos or restrictions. As a Dalit, my culture is different. Dalits do not practice menstrual taboos. I was never considered or treated as polluting and impure within my own household at any time, even during my periods. But upper caste people, including menstruating upper caste women, considered me to be impure and polluting even when I was not menstruating. Menstrual behavior and taboos are part and parcel of the caste and patriarchal design to maintain the hierarchy of caste structure by propagating and using the belief system of purity and pollution. Feminists protesting for the entry of menstruating women to the Sabrimala temple are reiterating the untouchability reference made in the Supreme Court judgment with the hashtag "Women are not untouchable." But they do not see untouchability and gender inequality through the lens of intersectionality. The focus is more on the inclusion of menstruating women than on the patriarchal features of the temple in the glorification and protection of male celibacy and the purification rituals therein. The discourse is silent on the problem of ritual purity being the patriarchal mechanism to maintain social inequality and the caste system. It ignores that the Dalit women and her particular and complex problems, untouchability, caste discrimination, and oppression, are different from that of a menstruating upper caste woman, yet linked to the same patriarchal and casteist scheme. The recent protests, which have raised menstruation to an unprecedented level on the gender debate, should become the entry point for addressing the role of caste and patriarchy in the complex oppression faced by Dalit women.
Did you know that endometriosis affects an estimated 176 million individuals around the world? Did you know that the disease is steeped in myths and misinformation that date back over a century, and that those myths and misinformation impact the quality of treatment that patients receive today? Did you know that the average delay in diagnosis is 7 to 12 years, and most patients find themselves dismissed, marginalized, invalidated, and told that the disease is all in their head? Did you know that endometriosis is more than just a menstrual disorder, and that it can impact every aspect of an individual's well-being, from their physical, mental, and emotional health to their ability to attend school, function in their careers, has an impact on their relationships and every other aspect of their well-being? Did you know that 70% of adolescents with endometriosis suffer from pelvic pain and later go on to obtain an accurate diagnosis? Did you know that high-quality, authoritative menstrual education curriculum that incorporates endometriosis has the power to overcome obstacles and help individuals know when, where, how, and why to seek help early on?
Menopause is the neglected phase of women's life, be it in the conversation within the household and community, or in the discourse of policy programs and research agenda. Within the limited studies available, menopause is either portrayed as positive, as it is the end of menstrual bleeding and thus removes the societal restrictions, or it is portrayed negatively, presenting it as a hormonal deficiency, often with a very stereotypical view of hot flashes, mood swings, etc. However, if we care to listen to women's voice, the reality of women's experience of menopause is much more complex. Our study, which tried to understand the uniqueness in the experience of menopause among Indian women, revealed 3 distinct but are co-occurring narratives of menopause. For some women, menopause was an insignificant event, and they hardly noticed it. For example, one of our participants, Kamala, shared that, "I do not have any issue, all of a sudden it stopped, and I was happy." For these women, menopause was a natural, normal life transition. However, for some other women, this was not the case. For example, Sarala, who's 15 years old, shared that, "It's a suffering. I suffered heavy and painful bleeding for 9 years. I used to bleed continuously for 15 to 20 days. So for these women, menopause was an extremely distressful event in their life with no support system during this phase of their life. The distress in the lives of poor women seemed to stem from the complex interaction of patriarchy, gender, and poverty. So the third narrative was that menopause was freedom and liberating. Women related it to freedom as freedom from stressful management of menstruation and freedom from social restriction. For example, our participant Seema shared that, "I'm happy that it stopped. I run a group for performing spiritual gatherings. It was so difficult to manage when I was menstruating."
We're focused in our chapter on how women with disabilities experience marginalisation, discrimination and violence through menstruation. So women and girls with disabilities are viewed as mentally and physically incapable of meeting gendered norms to conceal their menstruation, to control their sexuality and manage their fertility.
So Linda and I, as lawyers and legal scholars, are particularly interested in how the experience of women and girls with disabilities in relation to menstruation results in discrimination and violations of the legal rights, and how also this relates to their position in terms of international law.
So one example that we looked at where this is apparent is sterilisation. So sterilisation involves surgical procedures that have permanent effects on reproduction and menstruation, and these include hysterectomy and tubal ligation. And the court can order this on the basis of assumptions about the mental incapacity of women or girls, so going back to those stereotypes that I mentioned earlier, and the view that sterilisation is in a woman or girls' best interests.
International human rights law does provide a range of bases for asserting the rights of this group, particularly in relation to issues such as sterilisation, but in relation to other areas too. So the term menstrual status discrimination has actually been used by the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. The Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination of all forms of discrimination against women also understands gender-based violence against women as a form of discrimination and sees forced sterilisation as a form of gender-based violence. So there's certainly a range of areas of international law and domestic anti-discrimination law that are needed in assisting this group of women and girls with disabilities who face discrimination in relation to menstruation.
Menstrual leave provides someone who menstruates with time off if they are unable to work because of menstruation or because of the symptoms related to menstruation. And this time may be paid or unpaid depending on the company or depending on the national policy. Menstrual leave policies exist globally in countries such as Japan, Taiwan, China, Zambia, Mexico. And in some countries where there is no national policy, there are some companies who have taken upon themselves to implement menstrual leave, such as Coexist in the UK, Culture Machine in India, also Gazoop in India, and the Victorian Women's Trust in Australia. The main questions that we focus on answering in our chapter is whether a policy like this, like menstrual leave, would benefit or harm the overall well-being of someone who menstruates, including their health, their overall health and well-being, and their career advancement. And we explore some of the potential benefits, but also the potential drawbacks using existing research and by exploring some of the existing policies. We found that some of the potential benefits include promoting menstrual health and also potentially destigmatizing menstruation. However, at the same time, we find that there are potential drawbacks to these policies, including perpetuating some of the sexist beliefs and attitudes that exist within a society, and actually contributing to the menstrual stigma, actually perpetuating gender discrimination in the workplace, and finally medicalizing menstruation more so than it already is. So ultimately, the effects of menstrual leave policies on those who menstruate and their overall well-being is unclear right now. However, what seems to be evident is that many individuals who menstruate could benefit from some workplace flexibility more generally, like, for example, more time off, the ability to work from home or other locations, having a customized work schedule. Policies such as this would also benefit the well-being of all workers, not just those who menstruate.
Art holds powerful potential to break the social and cultural stigma around menstruating bodies by making the invisible visible and pushing the boundaries of what we know about the menstrual cycle. I'm Jen Lewis, the conceptual artist and menstrual designer behind Beauty and Blood. I'm also the contributing author of Chapter 58, entitled To Widen the Cycle, Artists Engage the Menstrual Cycle and Reproductive Justice. This chapter presents a selection of artwork and artist statements from Widening the Cycle, a historic exhibit that I curated and first displayed at the 2015 Society for Menstrual Cycle Research Conference in Boston, Massachusetts. In order to break the social and cultural stigma around the menstruating body, we must expand the conversation, or widen the cycle. We must begin to see all the ways that the menstrual cycle touches lives. We must acknowledge that menstruation is a human right that deserves a public dialogue, not simply the shame and silence that have been handed down from generation to generation. Danielle Boudou Fortuné, The Burden of Bearing. Gabriella Boros, The Curses. Nicole Special, The Lost Ones. Joanna Falzone, Threaded Together. Phoebe Mann, My Mirror. Ingrid Goldblum Block, Stop the Flow of Violence, period.
Jack Delaria and I co-wrote and drew. They drew and I wrote Chapter 7 based on a research project I conducted at the University of Wisconsin-Madison about trans and genderqueer and trans and non-binary menstruation. The research itself yields a really important analysis of gender and this axis of socio-biological studies, especially when it comes to gender, because menstruation is so highly gendered, but it's also a function of the biological body and these groups that we absolutely place bodies into. And of course, not everyone who menstruates is a woman, and not every woman menstruates. And this project contributes to that. I am so grateful that Jack Delaria was able to author and create these beautiful and amazing comic illustrations that show the daily life experiences that my participants shared with me, really talking about the way that menstruation shaped their identities and their conceptions of self, the way that individuals would interact in public bathroom settings, and how menstruation posed a real threat and or danger by the sound of products or the visibility of products in masculine spaces. And also the product packaging by companies and also like location of them in stores, and this high emphasis on femininity in menstrual products, products with butterflies on them and flowers and feminist empowerment symbols, and people who had wished for options, when they started menstruating, that were a little more genderqueer or gender fluid or even masculine in nature, and the lack of those options on the market. But also the way that people interact with healthcare and menstruation. Healthcare professionals tend to use menstruation as a marker of well-being, even for somebody who has been taking testosterone for 3 years, who wouldn't menstruate, or someone who had, had a hysterectomy or had surgery in other ways that would affect their menstruation.
A group of Indiana advocates called Periods for Pence, who use narratives about their menstrual cycles in order to protest an anti-abortion bill that was passed by former Governor Mike Pence in 2016. Menstrual equity is an issue of reproductive justice, and so advocacy for menstrual equity often aligns and intersects with the efforts of those who promote things like accessible and affordable reproductive health care and legislation that protects the right to have an abortion. My research demonstrates that Periods for Pence use narrative sharing, humor, and juxtaposition on social media and in calls made to Pence's office about their periods in order to argue that abortion is a right and a necessity. Strategies like narrative sharing help groups coalesce around a shared goal or purpose, and in this particular group's case, it also helps the members bond when they can commiserate around their individual experiences with menstruation. So in this way, Periods for Pence becomes a sort of spare no details space where people can be honest about the realities of being a menstruator. And of course, a lot of these posts and calls make jokes about periods and the highs and lows of having a period, but Periods for Pence's humor doesn't just work to make people laugh. It uses menstruation and the reproductive body as punchlines in order to point out the logical gaps in Pence's bill and really emphasize the bill's absurdity. And so ultimately what we see is this group of protesters who menstruate crafting an overarching narrative about periods that is still able to underscore how varying and unpredictable and unique periods are to each individual. And so that variability becomes juxtaposed to and refutes the idea that bodies can or should be regulated via law.
In conclusion, I want to say that women's voice mattered, women's location and geography mattered. Let's listen to women's own voice to make meanings of menopause.
But we definitely need more research into the effects of these policies, and we need to study those policies that already are in place to understand the potential effects, whether they be benefits or drawbacks.
I will highly recommend this book to policymakers and everyone else that is going to undertake any policy work, whether integrating MHM into various policies or coming up with a standalone policy.
The time to end the misinformation is now. The time to end the silence is now.